automobile manufacturer Packard and using the famous power plant under license. Now, if ever there were an aircraft that's an example of Anglo-American cooperation in military aviation, this aeroplane, the North American Mustang, is it, because it was produced to meet a British requirement. Famously, a British purchasing commission in New York City was on the search for potential new American-built fighter designs for the Royal Air Force during 1940. One of the companies they visited was North American Aviation in Dallas, Texas. We had the idea that potentially North American, which was still quite a new company at that point, albeit already building the Harvard trainer, one of which we'll see later in quantity for the RAF, could build the Curtiss P40 Warhawk for the RAF under license. However, North American had other ideas, and it came up with a design it called the NA-73. Its progress, that design, from initial conception to first flight before the end of 1940 wasn't quite as rapid in terms of the number of days involved as has sometimes been stated, but it was nonetheless astonishingly quick, and it produced a highly advanced fighter in aerodynamic terms. The aircraft duly went through flight testing and was earmarked for operational service, and indeed entered service with both the US Army Air Forces and the RAF, the Americans of the P51, in fairly short order, also known as the A-36, as a ground attack and dive bomber platform to the Americans, in which role it was very successful. That was with the Allison V1710 engine, which also equipped most Curtiss P40s. Very good engine for operations in the low-level role, but it rather ran out of puff at altitude, so this aircraft wasn't initially able to fulfill the potential that was certainly evident in the design as a high-altitude, long-range escort fighter. That's where Britain again really entered the story, because the then commanding officer of a unit-based structure called the Air Fighting Development Unit, which evaluated new aircraft and new capabilities for the RAF during wartime, Ian Campbell-Ord, was talking to a friend of his, a man called Ronnie Harker, who was a service liaison test pilot for Rolls-Royce. And between them, the idea was hatched that wouldn't it be a good proposal to engine this, I say, very streamlined fighter, and thereby transform its performance with a Rolls-Royce Merlin. A Mustang was duly converted with a Rolls-Royce built Merlin. It was test flown at the Rolls-Royce factory airfield at Hutchinson. Immediately, the transformation was clear. Rolls-Royce couldn't fulfill the sort of demand that was required, though, to produce the Merlins for Mustang production on top of stiff irons, mosquito blankets and the like. So that was where Packard entered the story in the United States by producing the Merlin, and this was where the legend of the Merlin Mustang was born. Mustang, however, continued until very late in the war between the RAF movement for low-level reconnaissance roles during the D-Day period. But it was the Merlin-powered versions, like the P51D that we see represented here, that were the great long-range escort fighters for the US 8th Air Force in the European theatre, and indeed for the US Army Air Forces out in the Pacific as well.
Well done, James. Photos you took there.
That's the final pass for this Mustang, which will be coming into land as well. And the markings, I mentioned the fact that this aircraft is named Jersey Jerk. That was the personal moniker applied to a P51D that was flown by one of the most notable 8th Air Force names of the Second World War, Donald Strait. He was assigned to the 361st Fighter Squadron stationed at Martlesham Heath in Suffolk, initially equipped with the P47 like we saw earlier. Strait wanted to name the first P47 that was allocated to him as Jersey Bounce, but his crew chief had other ideas, his crew chief being named Doc Watson, who was described later by Strait as a real tough kid, a leather worker from Boston. Strait put forward this idea of calling his Thunderbolt Jersey Bounce. Watson replied, "We can't do that, there's a guy in one of the other squadrons already named his airplane Jersey Bounce." And Strait didn't have a name on his fighter when he returned from his 5th mission. Watson said that his ground crew had come up with the name Jersey Jerk. Strait later recalled, "I said, 'Watson, I'm not a jerk.' To which Watson replied, 'Sir, let me tell you why we want to name it that. Any guy that would take off in a single-engine airplane, cross the North Sea in the wintertime, and take a chance of getting his rear shot off by the Luftwaffe or by anti-aircraft fire has got to be a jerk.'" The name stuck, and Donald Strait, who had enlisted in his state's National Guard before joining up formally with the US Army Air Forces, and later on served long into the post-war years with the New Jersey Air National Guard, is commemorated by this Australian-built Mustang as fighter aviation engineering.
And if you look away to your left-hand side as the Mustang is making its approach to land, you see that very curved fighter approach to the airfield. Well, if you imagine you're sat in the cockpit of a Mustang looking forward, you have very little forward visibility, especially when the aircraft comes into landing attitude and the nose gets higher and higher. Virtually no forward visibility, kind of like driving with your bonnet up. So many of these fighters make what we call the curved fighter approach, which is staying very tight to the runway, turning very tightly towards it, so you can at least keep sight of the runway for as long as possible, in this case out to the left-hand side of the canopy, and then keep